The world stands locked in the grip of the last glacial maximum around 20,000 years ago. Great sheets of ice cover much of the northern hemisphere, stretching down from what is now Canada and Scandinavia and pushing the boundaries of habitable land far to the south. In this age, the oceans withdraw. Water that once flowed freely across the planet is bound into towering ice sheets, frozen into massive glaciers that climb kilometers into the sky. With sea levels more than 100 meters lower than today, new landscapes appear where waves once rolled. Among the most important is a landmass that emerges between Siberia and Alaska, a vast bridge of earth and grassland stretching hundreds of kilometers wide, connecting two continents that in later ages will be separated by storm and tide. This is Beringia, a place that exists for thousands of years and yet vanishes almost entirely from the present world, drowned when the ice retreats. It is here that the story of the first human crossing begins. The land bridge is not barren. Though cold, it is far from lifeless. The expansion of steppe tundra, often called the Mammoth Steppe, creates an ecosystem of extraordinary productivity. Where ice does not smother the soil, hardy grasses, sedges and shrubs grow thick across wide plains. These feed immense herds of animals: mammoth steppe bison, wild horse caribou and musk ox. Predators thrive alongside them: wolves, lions adapted to the cold and bears of imposing size. The humans who enter this world do so as one more species in this complex web, reliant on fire and stone to endure the wind, the frost, and the unrelenting distances that define the land. Archaeological traces across Siberia show their persistence: stone blades napped from river cobbles, bone tools shaped with skill, and shelters ringed with mammoth bones to hold against the endless winds. These people know cold intimately, and their presence near the edge of the world prepares them for the bridge that lies beyond. One fact stands out in the scientific record. Sea levels during the last glacial maximum fell by more than 120 meters below modern levels. This single shift reveals the immensity of planetary change. It exposes not only Beringia, but entire continental shelves elsewhere: the Sunda Shelf linking Southeast Asia to islands, the Doggerland plains of northern Europe, and wide tracts of what are now drowned coasts in Africa and the Americas. Across the globe, the boundaries of land and sea alter dramatically, opening routes and closing others. Humanity is never alone in facing these transformations. The Earth itself is dynamic, and the rhythms of orbital cycles, carbon exchange, and ice albedo feedback drive landscapes to shift on scales vast and slow. The Bering Land Bridge is only one expression of this planetary rhythm, but for our species it becomes a decisive one. Archaeologists and geneticists together find evidence that groups of people moved eastward into this land during the height of the Ice Age. Yet the exact moment of first entry remains elusive. Some sites in Siberia date back more than 30,000 years, showing that humans had already reached the northeastern margins of Asia long before the last glacial maximum. Others hint at movement into Alaska earlier than once thought, though the evidence is scarce and often contested. The record is fragmentary, as glacial and periglacial processes erase much of what once lay upon the surface. Today, much of Beringia lies beneath the Bering Sea, submerged as ice melted and waters returned to the ocean basins. What is known comes from scattered sites on both sides of the former bridge, preserved in patches where erosion has not stripped them away. A lesser-known detail emerges from paleoecological studies. By extracting cores of ancient sediment from lakes and peat bogs across Alaska and Siberia, researchers find traces of pollen and DNA that show not only plants and animals, but the presence of human activity. Charcoal fragments embedded deep in these layers suggest that fires were lit in landscapes far north of what is usually imagined. In some cases, burned bones of large mammals reveal the butchery practices of hunters who depended on these animals for food, clothing, and shelter. These traces are faint, yet invaluable. They allow scientists to see beyond stone and bone tools into the broader interaction of humans with ecosystems, hinting at a continuous human presence along the edge of the land bridge long before full migrations into the Americas began. Still, mysteries endure. One of the most debated is whether people first crossed during the last glacial maximum itself, when ice sheets blocked further passage into the heart of North America, or whether they arrived only later when retreating glaciers opened corridors inland or along the coast. The evidence points in multiple directions, leaving the sequence unclear. Did people enter early, surviving in isolated refugees for millennia before spreading southward? Or did they remain confined to Siberia and Beringia until climates eased? Each possibility carries implications for the timeline of human dispersal across the continents. Some genetic models suggest a standstill lasting thousands of years in Beringia, a long pause before expansion. Others argue for earlier episodic movements that left faint traces now lost beneath water. The silence of the submerged land keeps this question unresolved. On a planetary scale, the Ice Age world emphasizes how thin the margin of survival is for both humans and animals. Average global temperatures fall by several degrees compared to today, but the change is amplified in the far north, where winters grow longer and summers barely thaw the frozen earth. Vast ice sheets reflect sunlight back into space, reinforcing cold conditions. Winds sweep unobstructed across plains, carrying dust and loess that bury soils in pale blankets. Yet even within these extremes, niches of life flourish. The mammoth steppe supports biomass greater than many modern grasslands, a paradox of fertility within cold. For humans, these niches are critical. They allow small groups to endure at the periphery of continents, hunting and gathering with persistence until openings appear. The scale of the land bridge itself is immense. At its widest, Beringia spans more than 1,000 kilometers from north to south, nearly the distance from Paris to Rome doubled. For those who travel it, the journey is not a single crossing, but a slow inhabitation of an entire region. Generations live and die within its bounds, treating it not as a passage, but as a homeland. Archaeological reconstructions suggest that for thousands of years, Beringia is not a corridor, but a refuge. Here, in a world of cold winds and endless horizons, the first steps into a new continent are prepared. As the Ice Age world unfolds, the bridge is not merely land, it is opportunity and barrier together. It reveals the profound connection between planetary change and human destiny. Without the lowering of seas, the Americas remain isolated. With it, they become accessible, though only to those willing to endure the edge of habitable Earth. The story begins in this expanded icy world where glaciers carve coasts, winds carry dust, and humans, small in number, yet persistent, learn to inhabit the spaces left open by retreating oceans. They stand upon ground that will one day vanish beneath waves, unaware that their movements here will shape the human presence across an entire hemisphere. From the western edges of Europe to the far northeastern reaches of Asia, a single ecological zone stretches almost without interruption during the last glacial maximum. This is the Mammoth Steppe, a corridor of grassland and tundra that endures for tens of thousands of years, bridging vast distances across the Old World. Unlike the fragmented landscapes of today, where forests, deserts, and mountains break the continuity, this corridor is remarkably uniform. It is a cold-adapted grassland that supports immense herds of grazing animals. And it is this continuity that allows humans to move steadily eastward, generation after generation, following resources and adjusting to each new horizon. Archaeologists often describe this steppe as one of the richest environments of the Ice Age world, paradoxically fertile despite its frigid climate. The character of the Mammoth Steppe rests in its vegetation. Grasses and herbaceous plants dominate, growing thick in the brief summers when sunlight lingers nearly without end. These plants provide energy-dense forage that sustains herds of herbivores in numbers astonishing to modern eyes. Steppe bison, wild horses, woolly rhinoceroses, saiga antelope, and woolly mammoths populate the plains in countless thousands, grazing in cycles across seasonal ranges. Where animals move, humans follow. Hunters use finely crafted blades to butcher carcasses, shaping them into food and tools. Scrapers made from flint or chert process hides into warm clothing, while bone awls stitch together seams. Spears tipped with stone or bone points serve both for hunting and defense. The corridor is not simply traversed. It is lived in, with groups adapting their lives to the rhythms of herds and seasons. A fact that grounds this corridor in science comes from stable isotope analysis of animal bones recovered across Eurasia. By measuring the ratios of carbon and nitrogen in bone collagen, researchers reconstruct the diets of Ice Age animals, and from them the productivity of the grasslands they grazed. These analyses reveal that the Mammoth Steppe was far more nutrient-rich than modern Arctic tundra. Even in climates where winter temperatures plunged far below freezing, the cycle of growth and grazing was efficient enough to sustain densities of herbivores that exceed those of most modern grasslands. For humans, this means not only an abundant food source, but also an expanding frontier of possibility. The grasslands did not merely allow survival, they offered the means for dispersal across continents. Among the lesser-known details of this corridor are the campsites discovered along rivers and loess bluffs, many of them marked by rings of mammoth bones. These structures, some more than 20,000 years old, are interpreted as dwellings frameworks of bone covered by hides to form shelters against the wind. Inside hearths left behind layers of ash fragments of bone, and occasionally beads carved from ivory. Such sites remind us that the steppe was not only a hunting ground, but also a place of settlement, even if temporary, where families gathered, fires burned, and knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Though archaeologists cannot recover voices or names, the remains of these encampments show continuity of occupation across thousands of kilometers, a thread that links communities from Ukraine to Siberia. Yet mysteries remain. One enduring question concerns how far east these groups traveled before the last glacial maximum closed off routes into the Americas. Did people already live in northeastern Siberia 30 or even 40,000 years ago, or did they only reach this remote edge much later? The evidence is uneven. Some sites in Siberia, such as Yana RHS along the Yana River, show human presence around 32,000 years ago. These finds include stone tools, worked ivory, and evidence of mammoth hunting at latitudes far into the Arctic Circle. Such discoveries demonstrate remarkable adaptability to extreme cold. But whether these populations contributed directly to later migrants across Beringia is still uncertain. Genetic data suggest complex patterns of survival replacement and admixture, but the details remain unclear. The corridor gives access, but the identities of those who used it change through time. On the scale of the planet, the Mammoth Steppe Corridor illustrates the extent to which climate organizes life across continents. Global cooling not only lowers sea levels but also shifts precipitation and vegetation zones southward. Forests that once dominated Central Europe retreat, leaving open plains behind. Deserts expand in some regions, while in others, the dominance of grasses creates new routes for animals and humans alike. The effect is continental in scope. An unbroken ecological zone stretches from Spain to Alaska, making it possible in theory to follow herds across half the Earth's circumference. For humans, the world feels interconnected, bound not by oceans, but by land and grass. This connectivity is temporary, yet it becomes the stage for one of the most significant migrations in human prehistory. The scale of distances involved is difficult to grasp without comparison, from the plains of Ukraine to the Kolyma River near the Bering Sea. The corridor measures nearly 8,000 kilometers longer than the distance from London to Cape Town. No single group of humans would cover this span in a lifetime, but across generations movements accumulate. Families shift hunting grounds a few valleys farther each season. Children grow up and establish camps beyond familiar rivers, and gradually the frontier advances. Migration is not a sudden leap, but a slow expansion measured in lifetimes rather than years. By the time some groups reach the edges of Siberia, thousands of years have passed since their distant ancestors first set foot on the steppe. The land itself seems endless, but the steppe corridor gradually narrows, funneling toward the place where Asia ends and new continents begin. Evidence of this long movement comes not only from archaeology but also from the genetic record. Ancient DNA extracted from human remains in Siberia shows connections between populations of Europe, Central Asia, and Northeastern Asia, confirming that people moved through the corridor repeatedly. One striking discovery involves genetic links between Siberian groups and the ancestors of indigenous peoples of the Americas, a signal that demonstrates the corridor was the pathway that eventually led to the peopling of the New World. Yet even within this broad connection, there are hints of complexity admixture, with Denisovan's interactions with other now-vanished groups and genetic bottlenecks that suggest times of isolation. The corridor is not only a passage, but also a filter shaping the genetic makeup of those who travel it. The Mammoth Steppe, then, is both opportunity and constraint. Its openness allows herds and hunters to move, but its cold and vastness test endurance. Rivers freeze and thaw, with the seasons creating barriers at certain times of year. Blizzards and storms sweep across the plains, burying food beneath snow. Predators stalk herds, and humans themselves must guard against scarcity in long winters. Yet despite these challenges, people continue to occupy this world. The corridor does not deter them, it defines them. By the time groups reach the easternmost edges of Siberia, they are already specialists in living within cold grasslands, their survival tied to the great herds that move endlessly across the horizon. As the Mammoth Steppe corridor carries them ever closer to the land bridge that waits beyond it, also weaves them into a wider ecological story. The grasses bind carbon from the atmosphere, influencing global cycles. The ice reflects sunlight, holding temperatures low. Dust blown from exposed shelves fertilizes distant oceans. Every element connects, and humans move within this web, small in number, yet persistent in motion. The corridor is not merely the backdrop to migration. It is the stage upon which humans, animals, and climate together shape the course of prehistory. At the far northeastern margin of the Old World, human groups learn to live at the limits of what the Ice Age world allows. These are people of the frozen edge inhabiting environments where winter temperatures plunge to levels lethal without constant vigilance. Here, in the tundra landscapes of Siberia and Beringia, life depends on the ability to adapt. Archaeology reveals the ingenuity of these groups through the tools, dwellings and traces of subsistence they leave behind. Their world is marked by scarcity and abundance in strange alternation, endless cold that threatens survival, yet great herds of animals whose presence makes existence possible. It is in this fragile balance that the foundations for the crossing into new continents are laid. One of the most striking facts about these northern peoples is their mastery of clothing. Sewing needles fashioned from bone and ivory appear in sites more than 30,000 years old. With these hunters and their families stitched together hides and furs into garments tailored close to the body, layered for insulation and capable of keeping out the wind. This innovation allows humans to push into latitudes once thought uninhabitable. Without tailored clothing, survival in the open Arctic would be impossible. Combined with shelters framed from bones and hides, and with hearths burning fuel gathered from driftwood animal fat or even dried moss, these people establish a presence at the very edge of the world. Archaeologists studying microscopic wear traces on needles confirm that complex sewing was not occasional but routine, showing how central clothing became to daily life. A lesser-known detail emerges from evidence of pigments found at northern sites. Small lumps of ochre, sometimes with grinding stones, appear alongside tools and ornaments. The use of ochre in these contexts suggests more than symbolic behavior. It may have had practical functions such as treating hides, repelling insects, or preserving materials. In some cases, beads made of ivory or stone accompany these pigments, hinting at the presence of adornment even in harsh environments. These fragments indicate that people of the frozen edge did not abandon cultural expression in favor of mere survival. Instead, they carried forward traditions of color, ornament and meaning, even while contending with unrelenting cold. Such findings remind us that adaptation is never only biological or technological, it is also cultural, sustained through shared practices and symbols. The mysteries of this world lie partly in how populations survived isolation. Genetic studies suggest that groups living in Beringia may have been cut off from their relatives farther west for thousands of years, surrounded by ice sheets and difficult terrain. This so-called Beringian standstill is inferred from genetic bottlenecks seen in modern indigenous populations of the Americas. But how such small groups endured in isolation is uncertain. Did they maintain networks of exchange along rivers and coasts, or were they truly trapped between glaciers? Did some populations vanish entirely, leaving only faint traces in the genes of later peoples? The archaeological record is fragmentary, with few sites securely dated, and so the daily reality of these long centuries remains unclear. This unresolved puzzle underscores the precariousness of life at the frozen edge. On a planetary scale, the presence of humans in these latitudes illustrates the resilience of the species. Global climate during the last glacial maximum is several degrees colder than today, but the difference is amplified at high latitudes where temperatures can fall to extremes unimaginable in temperate regions. Ice sheets extend across continents, altering wind patterns and precipitation. Yet, even in this altered world, humans find ways to carve out livable niches. The very existence of people in northeastern Siberia demonstrates a capacity to adjust to planetary shifts, to occupy spaces shaped by forces beyond their control. The Earth's systems of ice, ocean, and atmosphere create challenges, and humans persist not by resisting but by adapting to what is given. Scale reinforces the strangeness of their situation. From the central plains of Eurasia to the coasts of the Bering Sea is a journey of thousands of kilometers. Yet by the time groups reach the frozen edge, they are no longer pioneers. Generations have lived and died in movement eastward, each contributing only a fragment of the larger expansion. To the individuals themselves, the tundra is not the end of a journey, but the entirety of their world. The horizons are vast, the winters long, and the herds are both sustenance and necessity. It is only from the perspective of millennia that one sees the edge as a threshold, a liminal space before the entry into another continent. Archaeological evidence of subsistence practices further illuminates the life of these groups. At sites along the Yana River and elsewhere, the remains of hunted mammoth, horse and bison are found in abundance. But alongside them are fish bones, bird remains and smaller mammals, showing that diets were broad and opportunistic. This diversification may have been essential to surviving lean years when large game was scarce. The use of storage pits, sometimes lined with stone, indicates planning beyond immediate needs. These pits suggest that families cached meat and fat to sustain them through long winters, a strategy that reflects foresight and adaptation to cycles of scarcity. Such practices anchor life in places where the margin of survival is razor thin. There is also evidence of interaction with the broader Ice Age ecology. Wolves and humans often competed for the same prey. Yet over time, some wolves may have begun to associate with human camps. Genetic studies of ancient canids suggest that domestication of dogs may have begun in these northern environments, though the timing remains contested. If so, then the frozen edge may not only have tested humans, but also set the stage for one of the earliest human-animal partnerships. The presence of dogs would have altered hunting strategies, transport, and even survival, though the archaeological evidence remains incomplete. The possibility itself adds another layer of complexity to understanding how people endured here. The frozen edge is a place of contrasts. Summers, though brief, bring bursts of life. Rivers swell with meltwater tundra, flowers bloom, and birds arrive in great numbers to breed. In these months, hunting and gathering are abundant and movement across the landscape is easier. Winters, however, return with unrelenting severity. Darkness stretches for long weeks, snow covers the ground, and temperatures drop so low that even with clothing and fire survival requires constant vigilance. For humans here, the year is a cycle of preparation and endurance, of taking from the brief abundance to withstand the long scarcity. This rhythm shapes not only subsistence, but also social life, as families and bands rely on cooperation to survive the leanest times. The very edge of Siberia, facing the frozen waters of what is now the Bering Sea, is both the end of one continent and the beginning of another. To those who lived here, it was simply home, a place of wind, snow, and life carried on at the limit of human endurance. Yet in hindsight, it is clear that these people stood at a threshold of extraordinary significance. From this frozen edge, the first steps into the Americas would one day be taken, steps that would carry humanity into entirely new landscapes and set in motion one of the great chapters of prehistory. For now, the edge remains both a boundary and a homeland, a testament to the resilience of those who adapt to the most unforgiving of worlds. Across the Mammoth Steppe and deep into Beringia, the movements of people are bound tightly to the rhythms of the animals they depend upon. Herds of mammoth, bison, horse, and caribou migrate in sweeping arcs across plains and valleys, guided by seasons and forage. For humans, these animals are not only food, but also materials for clothing, shelter, tools, and fuel. The connection is so complete that the paths of people mirror the paths of herds, forming a web of movement that stretches across continents. To follow the great herds is to follow life itself, and this pursuit shapes the course of migration into the Americas. Archaeological remains testify to the intensity of these relationships. Sites scattered along ancient riverbanks in Siberia and Alaska contain dense layers of butchered bones, often showing cut marks from stone tools and traces of marrow extraction. Mammoth bones in particular dominate many sites, suggesting specialized hunting or scavenging strategies. At places such as Berelech in northeastern Siberia, archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of mammoth bones, perhaps representing mass kill events or repeated butchering over generations. The evidence makes clear that people knew not only how to bring down such massive animals, but also how to process them efficiently, extracting every calorie of fat and protein, every useful fragment of ivory and hide. Such skill was essential for survival in landscapes where plant foods were limited and winters were long. A fact grounded in modern research comes from isotopic analysis of human remains found in the Arctic regions. These studies reveal diets extraordinarily high in animal protein, often rivaling the carnivorous diets of predators. Humans of the far north during the Ice Age relied overwhelmingly on meat and fat, adapting their physiology and technology to make the most of this resource. Cooking fires and boiling stones helped render fat and marrow, while storage pits preserved meat into the leanest months. Such reliance on animal resources also meant that human survival rose and fell with the health of herds. A decline in one species could force shifts in hunting strategy, pushing groups to pursue new prey or expand into new territories. A lesser-known detail lies in the tools crafted from the animals themselves. Ivory from mammoth tusks was carved into awls points and even decorative objects. Bones of reindeer and bison became needles, fishhooks, and sled runners. Hides were worked into clothing and lashings, while sinew served as strong, flexible thread. Nothing was wasted, and the knowledge of how to use each material was passed carefully between generations. In this way, the great herds not only fed people, but also furnished the raw materials for their entire way of life. The tools and ornaments that survive in archaeological contexts remind us of this interdependence, showing how the lives of humans were inseparable from those of animals. Mystery, however, surrounds the methods of hunting itself. How did small groups of humans bring down animals as formidable as mammoths? Some evidence suggests coordinated drives into marshes or ravines where animals could be trapped and killed with spears. Other sites show traces of large fires, perhaps used to channel herds into confined areas. But the details remain uncertain, as few direct hunting scenes are preserved in the archaeological record. It is possible that much of the human reliance on mammoth was not from active hunting, but from scavenging carcasses of animals that died naturally. This debate continues among researchers, reflecting the difficulty of reconstructing behavior from fragmentary evidence. What is clear is that humans were able to obtain immense quantities of resources from megafauna, whether through deliberate hunting or opportunistic strategies, and that this relationship shaped their movements across the steppe and tundra. On the planetary scale, the movement of herds was itself influenced by glacial and climatic forces. As ice sheets grew, they displaced ecosystems southward, compressing ranges of animals and altering migration patterns. Rivers, swollen with meltwater, created barriers, while exposed continental shelves expanded available grazing land. The animals adapted to these changes, shifting their routes year by year, and humans followed in turn. This chain of dependence linked human fate not only to animals, but also to the larger systems of climate and ice that determined where grasses grew and where herds could move. The result was a global web of interconnection with forces operating across thousands of kilometers, shaping the choices of hunters on the ground. The scale of these movements is striking. A herd of caribou can migrate hundreds of kilometers in a single season, covering distances equivalent to entire countries. To follow them requires mobility light shelters and the ability to travel across snow ice and river crossings. Families would have had to carry their possessions with them or return seasonally to known camps, creating rhythms of life tied to animal cycles. In Beringia, the journeys may have extended across hundreds of kilometers of open plains, linking river valleys, coastal margins, and interior plateaus. Each crossing was not only physical but generational, a continuity of movement that gradually brought humans closer to new lands. Hunting the great herds also shaped social life. Cooperation was necessary to bring down large prey, requiring coordination among groups of hunters. Such cooperation may have reinforced bonds within bands and contributed to the sharing of resources beyond immediate families. Ethnographic parallels from more recent Arctic peoples suggest that rituals and traditions often grew around the hunting of large animals, with rules about how carcasses were divided, how bones were treated, and how gratitude was expressed. While direct evidence of ritual is scarce in the Ice Age, north the presence of carved ivory beads and ochre hints that symbolic practices may have accompanied subsistence. Hunting was not only practical, but also bound up with meaning shaping identity as well as survival. The following of herds inevitably led people to the threshold of new continents. As animals expanded their ranges into Beringia, humans went with them, extending their knowledge of landscapes with each season. Mammoth trails became human trails. Rivers that served as migration corridors for bison also became corridors for people. The land bridge itself, stretching between Asia and North America, was not simply a passage of bare earth, but a continuation of the same steppe tundra that animals already used. From the perspective of hunters, the bridge was not a leap into the unknown, but an extension of familiar patterns carrying the herds they relied upon and thus making settlement possible. Yet the great herds also contained within them fragility. Climate change at the end of the Ice Age, combined with human hunting pressure, would eventually drive many of these animals to extinction. For the humans who first crossed into the Americas, the initial abundance of megafauna offered immense opportunities. But in the longer view, the decline of these species forced new adaptations leading to changes in diet, technology, and social organization. The story of following the herds is therefore both a beginning and a warning, a reminder that human survival has always been entwined with the fate of other species, and that abundance can quickly give way to scarcity when environments shift. For now, in the depths of the Ice Age, the herds still move in vast numbers across the frozen plains. Humans shadow their movements, setting camp along rivers and ridges, building fires of bone and wood, and crafting tools from the remains of their prey. Each step eastward brings them closer to lands unseen, but each step is guided not by maps or plans, but by the paths of animals. To follow the great herds is to follow life into the heart of Beringia, to the edge of Asia, and eventually beyond into a hemisphere that waits still untouched by human presence. When sea levels fell during the Ice Age, coastlines shifted outward across the world. Entire landscapes that once lay beneath the sea were exposed, forming plains, deltas, and estuaries that supported plants, animals, and human settlement. In Beringia, the shoreline extended far into what is now the Bering Sea, creating lowlands rich in resources. These shores no longer exist in the modern world, submerged after the glaciers melted. Yet during the time of first migrations, they were central to human life. Understanding these vanished coasts allows us to glimpse how people survived and how they moved along pathways now hidden beneath water. One of the most solid facts about these ancient coasts is the dramatic fall in sea levels during the last glacial maximum by about 120 meters compared to today. This fall exposed not only the Bering Land Bridge but also coastlines around the world's Sunda, connecting Southeast Asia with islands like Borneo and Java Sahul, linking New Guinea with Australia and Doggerland, spanning the North Sea. In Beringia, the exposed continental shelf created an area larger than many modern countries, a land of rivers, lakes and wetlands where humans could hunt fish and gather. The very existence of these coasts shows the planetary scale of Ice Age transformations, how ice sheets sculpted the map of Earth and opened temporary worlds for habitation. A lesser-known detail about the Beringian shores comes from paleo-environmental reconstructions. Sediment cores taken from the floor of the Bering Sea contain fossilized pollen grains and plant DNA that reveal a mosaic of environments. Grasses, sedges and dwarf shrubs dominated, but there were also patches of willow and birch in sheltered areas. Such diversity would have supported not only herds of grazing animals, but also smaller game birds and freshwater fish in the rivers that flowed across the exposed shelf. For humans, these shores were not barren tundra, but complex ecotones rich in resources compared to the ice-covered mountains to the south and north. The fact that most of this land is now underwater explains why so much of the archaeological record of early coastal life is missing, buried beneath meters of sediment and sea. The mystery that lingers is whether humans used these coasts as their primary migration route into the Americas. Some archaeologists propose a kelp highway hypothesis, in which groups traveled southward along the Pacific Rim, exploiting marine resources such as shellfish fish and sea mammals. The productivity of kelp forests, combined with the accessibility of shoreline habitats, would have made such a route feasible. Yet direct evidence remains elusive. Submerged sites are difficult to locate and excavate, and what little has been found often lies buried under deep water. Did the first migrants hug the coasts, moving from one rich estuary to another, or did they rely more heavily on inland routes through Beringia? The answer remains unresolved, hidden beneath the waves. On a planetary scale, the disappearance of these coasts reminds us how fluid Earth's geography is over long timescales. What today seems like permanent shorelines, oceans meeting land in stable boundaries, are in fact transient stages in a cycle of glacial advance and retreat. As ice sheets expand, they draw down the oceans and reveal new lands. As they melt, seas rise and erase them again. Human history is deeply entangled with this rhythm. Entire chapters of settlement and migration occurred in places now lost to the sea, their evidence drowned. The shores of Beringia belong to this vanished geography, a reminder that much of human prehistory remains inaccessible, preserved beneath oceans rather than on land. The scale of these lost landscapes is immense. Estimates suggest that Beringia at its maximum may have covered more than 1.5 million square kilometers, larger than modern Mexico. Much of this expanse lay in low-lying coastal plains dotted with rivers flowing into shallow bays. For people living there, the sea would have been distant on the horizon, and the shoreline a place of abundance rather than danger. Fishing with bone hooks or spears, gathering shellfish along tidal flats, hunting waterfowl in wetlands, all of these activities would have supplemented diets dominated by megafauna. The combination of land and sea resources may have made these coasts among the most favorable habitats in the high latitudes of the Ice Age world. archaeological traces that survive on present-day coasts offer faint glimpses of this lost world. In places like the Aleutian Islands and southeast Alaska, early sites show reliance on marine resources thousands of years ago, suggesting that such strategies were well within human capability. Driftwood carried by currents provided essential fuel for fires, while skins of seals and sea lions could be crafted into waterproof coverings. Stone tools found near ancient shorelines often show signs of fish processing or working of hides adapted for wet environments. These small clues point toward a broader adaptation to coastal life, one that may have extended far back into the vanished lowlands of Beringia. Another layer of evidence comes from genetics. Mitochondrial DNA lineages among indigenous peoples of the Americas indicate diversification around the time when populations may have lived in isolation in Beringia. Such lineages could reflect groups inhabiting coastal as well as inland zones, their survival tied to the varied resources of both environments. While genetic data cannot specify exact locations, they reinforce the idea that people endured in Beringia for thousands of years before spreading southward. Whether they lived mainly on coasts or inland plains, the lost shoreline was almost certainly part of their story. Life along these shores would have carried its own cycles and hazards. Storms sweeping across the exposed shelf could transform rivers into torrents and flood lowlands. Seasonal ice would lock harbours and estuaries, restricting fishing in winter months. Yet the annual thaw would bring migrations of fish and birds, filling the landscape with life. Families may have shifted camps seasonally, moving inland during storms and back toward the coast during periods of abundance. The interplay of land and sea created a rhythm distinct from inland hunting, one that required flexibility but offered rich rewards. What remains striking is how much of this world has vanished from view. Archaeologists estimate that perhaps two-thirds of the campsites, hearths and middens used by Ice Age people in Beringia now lie beneath the sea. This means that the story we reconstruct today is incomplete, a patchwork from uplands and river valleys, while the heart of human settlement may be hidden offshore. Advances in underwater archaeology and sediment DNA analysis hold promise, but for now, the mystery endures. The first footsteps along the Beringian shores may remain forever unseen. The vanished coasts remind us that the human journey is shaped not only by adaptation, but by disappearance. Lands once central to survival can be erased in geological time, leaving only faint echoes in genetic memory and scattered artifacts. For the first people to cross into the Americas, these shores provided staging grounds, refuges and pathways. Yet in the modern world, they are absent, drowned beneath cold northern seas. To imagine them is to picture a world both familiar and strange, where Asia and America were joined not by a narrow strait, but by a wide and fertile plain, where rivers meandered across lowlands now hidden, and where humans looked across horizons that no longer exist. As groups of humans reached the land bridge connecting Asia and North America, they encountered not an open highway, but a region that became their home for thousands of years. Archaeologists and geneticists call this chapter the Beringian Standstill, a time when people occupied the vast plains of Beringia, yet could not easily move farther into the Americas. Ice sheets to the east and south blocked passage, while tundra and permafrost defined the land itself. This standstill is not a pause in the literal sense of stillness, but a long period of habitation, of endurance and adaptation in a land that no longer exists. A central fact comes from genetics. Studies of mitochondrial DNA from indigenous peoples of the Americas reveal that ancestral populations underwent a long period of isolation, likely between 15 and 25,000 years ago. The genetic diversity suggests that these groups remained separate from other Eurasian populations for several millennia before dispersing southward. The simplest explanation is that they lived in Beringia, unable to move further due to glacial barriers, yet thriving in numbers sufficient to preserve and diversify lineages. This genetic standstill matches the geological reality at the height of the last glacial maximum. The Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets merged, sealing off the interior of North America, while glaciers along the Pacific Rim made coastal passage difficult. Beringia itself became both refuge and boundary. A lesser-known detail of this standstill emerges from ecological reconstructions. During the period of isolation, Beringia was not entirely frozen wasteland, but a diverse patchwork of habitats. Pollen records and ancient DNA from lake sediments reveal grasslands mixed with shrub tundra and occasional groves of willow and alder in sheltered valleys. Rivers and wetlands cut through the plains, supporting fish and waterfowl. These mosaics of habitat provided varied resources: large herbivores on the open steppe, smaller mammals in the shrublands, and fish in the streams. Families living in Beringia would have had to master all these environments, shifting strategies with the seasons and storing food to endure the long winters. The diversity of ecological niches may explain how populations survived for millennia in apparent isolation. The unresolved mystery is the exact duration and location of this standstill. Did people live primarily on the exposed coastal plains now beneath the Bering Sea, or in upland valleys of Alaska and Chukotka? Estimates of timing vary, with some models suggesting isolation as early as 25,000 years ago, others closer to 15,000. The archaeological record is sparse in part because so much of Beringia is submerged. Few sites securely dated to this interval exist, leaving researchers to piece together indirect evidence from genetics and paleoecology. Whether the standstill lasted for a few thousand years or more than 10,000 remains uncertain, as does the question of whether people moved back and forth across the land bridge or remained in more localized refuges. On the planetary scale, the Beringian standstill reflects the interplay between glaciation sea level and human persistence. Ice sheets, kilometers thick, locked away enough water to drop oceans worldwide, exposing the land bridge. At the same time, those very ice sheets created barriers that confined populations. The rhythms of Earth's orbit, tilting and wobbling across tens of thousands of years, determined when the ice would advance and retreat. Human fate was caught within these cycles. The standstill, then, is not simply a human story, but a planetary one, showing how orbital mechanics and glacial dynamics shaped the course of migration into an entire hemisphere. The scale of time involved also deepens perspective. If the standstill lasted, for example, 5,000 years, that is longer than the entire span of recorded history since the first writing in Mesopotamia. Entire cultures could rise and vanish in such a period. For the people of Beringia, this was not waiting at a gateway, but living in a homeland. Generations were born, hunted, raised children, and buried their dead within this land. To them, Beringia was not a bridge, but the world itself. The idea of crossing into a new continent would have held no meaning. They lived within the landscapes available to them, following herds and rivers as they always had. The perception of a standstill exists only in hindsight, when seen as a pause before the dispersal into the Americas. Material evidence of this life is scarce but telling. Hearths found in Alaskan sites contain charred bone and stone flakes indicating repeated occupation. bones of mammoth bison and horse show butchery marks, while worked ivory reveals skilled craftsmanship. Tools from these sites are similar to those found across northern Eurasia, showing continuity with earlier traditions, yet also gradual local adaptation. The scarcity of wood forced greater reliance on bone ivory and stone shaping toolkits in ways that reflected available resources. The pattern is one of persistence, maintaining traditions of hunting and tool-making while adjusting to the specifics of the Beringian environment. Another important aspect of the standstill is the question of social networks. Did isolated groups in Beringia remain connected across distances, or did they fragment into smaller bands? Some archaeologists suggest that rivers served as highways, allowing seasonal gatherings and exchanges. Genetic evidence hints at diversity within the Beringian population, suggesting that people did not remain entirely isolated from one another. Seasonal aggregation sites where multiple families came together to share resources and information may have been essential for maintaining social cohesion. Without such networks, survival in such a harsh land would have been even more precarious. The standstill also invites speculation about early encounters with changing environments. As climates shifted slightly warmer around 18,000 years ago, patches of shrub and tree spread into the tundra. Did people burn landscapes to encourage grazing animals, or did they simply follow the natural shifts? Charcoal layers in some sediments hint at the presence of fire, though whether from natural lightning strikes or deliberate burning is unclear. If humans managed vegetation in even small ways, they would have influenced the availability of game and altered ecosystems subtly but significantly. The possibility remains one of many questions left open in the absence of direct evidence. The sheer scale of Beringia also complicates the story. Spanning over 1,000 kilometers from north to south and more than 3,000 from east to west, it was not a narrow bridge, but an entire subcontinent. To live in Beringia was to inhabit a vast landscape of plains, rivers, and low hills larger than many modern nations combined. Within such a space, populations could expand and contract, move seasonally, and remain unseen in the archaeological record. The idea of a single standstill location oversimplifies what was likely a complex mosaic of movements across a broad and changing region. What is clear is that Beringia served as both refuge and crucible. Populations that survived here developed the resilience and adaptations that later allowed them to move into the Americas. The standstill was not a gap in human history, but a vital chapter one that shaped genetic lineages and cultural practices. When the glaciers eventually retreated, opening corridors southward, it was the descendants of these Beringian peoples who expanded across two continents, carrying with them the legacy of millennia spent at the edge of ice and sea. The Beringian standstill, though invisible in modern geography, remains written in gene sediments and scattered artifacts. It testifies to the ability of humans to persist not just for years or centuries, but for millennia in landscapes that test endurance. While much of the evidence lies drowned beneath northern seas, the outline of this chapter grows clearer with each study. The shores that no longer exist once held lives rich and full, and the land that connected Asia and America was not merely a passage, but a homeland shaped by patience, persistence, and the rhythms of the frozen earth. The story of the first people to cross the Bering Land Bridge is written not only in stone tools and buried camps, but also in the molecules preserved within ancient remains. In the last 2 decades, genetic research has opened a new dimension of understanding, revealing patterns invisible in the soil alone. Ancient DNA preserved in bone teeth and even sediments has become one of the strongest sources of evidence, for when and how populations spread across Beringia and into the Americas. These genetic traces confirm long periods of isolation, hint at intermingling with other archaic humans, and reveal lineages that endure in present-day indigenous peoples of the Americas. One of the most solid facts from this field is the identification of a genetic bottleneck that occurred among the ancestors of Native American populations. Studies of mitochondrial DNA and nuclear genomes show reduced genetic diversity consistent with a long period of isolation in Beringia, followed by rapid expansion southward. This genetic signature aligns with the archaeological hypothesis of the Beringian standstill. What is remarkable is the timing analyses of mutation rates suggest the bottleneck occurred between 15 and 25,000 years ago, closely matching the period when glacial barriers blocked entry into the Americas. In this way, genetics reinforces what geology and archaeology had already proposed, offering an independent line of evidence for the standstill. A lesser-known detail from ancient DNA studies comes from discoveries of genetic material in sediments. Even in sites where no human bones survive, soil samples can yield fragments of DNA shed from skin cells, hair, or bodily fluids. In caves across Siberia and Alaska, researchers have recovered human DNA that confirms the presence of people long after bones themselves had decayed. These sedimentary DNA samples expand the range of evidence dramatically, allowing scientists to detect human presence in regions otherwise silent in the archaeological record. They also reveal the animals and plants that coexisted with humans, painting a fuller picture of ecosystems at the time. In Beringia, sediment DNA has shown traces of mammoth, horse and bison, confirming the persistence of the great herds that sustained human populations. Yet mysteries remain in the genetic record. One of the most debated concerns the exact relationship between the first Americans and other populations of Eurasia. Some studies suggest admixture with ancient Siberian groups, distinct from later East Asian populations. Others point to traces of Denisovan ancestry inherited from encounters between Homo sapiens and archaic humans tens of thousands of years earlier. These signals complicate the narrative, showing that the ancestors of the first Americans were not a single homogeneous group, but rather the product of long histories of movement, interaction, and mixing across Eurasia. The precise routes and timing of these interactions are still under investigation, and each new ancient genome has the potential to alter the picture. On the planetary scale, the significance of ancient DNA lies in how it demonstrates the mobility of humans across vast landscapes. Genes flow across continents carried by small groups whose movements accumulate over millennia. What archaeology sees as scattered sites, genetics weaves into broader patterns of connection and separation. The glacial cycles that altered coastlines and opened or closed corridors left signatures not only in geography but also in genomes. Populations expanded when climates allowed contracted, when barriers rose, and left echoes of these expansions and contractions in their DNA. In this sense, the genetic record is a parallel archive to the geological one, both shaped by the same planetary rhythms. The scale of insight from ancient DNA can be illustrated through one discovery in Alaska. At a site near the Tanana River, archaeologists uncovered the remains of two infants buried more than 11,000 years ago. Analysis of their genomes revealed ancestry deeply connected to the earliest branches of Native American lineages, confirming that by this time people had long been established in the Americas. Even more importantly, the genomes showed divergence from Asian populations that had occurred thousands of years earlier, consistent with a prolonged period of isolation in Beringia. These findings demonstrate how even a single burial can illuminate vast spans of prehistory, linking present-day peoples with ancestors who lived at the close of the Ice Age. Ancient DNA also reveals patterns of dispersal within the Americas. Genetic signals suggest that once populations entered the continent, they spread with remarkable speed, reaching South America within a few thousand years. Such rapid expansion is consistent with archaeological discoveries from sites like Monteverde in Chile, dated to at least 14,500 years ago. The genetic evidence supports the idea that the initial dispersal was swift and widespread, filling ecological niches across diverse environments. This speed highlights how long preparation in Beringia may have equipped populations with the resilience to adapt quickly once barriers fell. Another layer of detail comes from the study of Y chromosome lineages and mitochondrial haplogroups. Specific haplogroups such as C and Q on the paternal line and A, B, C, D and X on the maternal line appear widely among indigenous peoples of the Americas, yet they trace back to origins in Asia. Their distribution across the continent reflects the branching of populations as they moved southward and eastward. By mapping these haplogroups, researchers can reconstruct the broad outlines of migration, though the fine details remain blurred. The persistence of these lineages into modern times underscores the continuity between ancient migrations and present-day communities. Despite these advances, the genetic record still raises unresolved questions. How many separate migrations occurred across Beringia? Some studies suggest a single major dispersal, while others hint at multiple waves. Did later populations from Asia contribute additional ancestry after the first dispersal, or was the bridge effectively closed once sea levels rose? The evidence is not yet decisive. Similarly, the role of coastal versus inland routes remains debated. Genetics confirms movement, but does not always specify pathways, leaving room for continued exploration through archaeology and paleo-environmental science. From a planetary perspective, the very preservation of ancient DNA is itself remarkable. Cold climates slow the decay of molecules, allowing genetic fragments to endure for tens of thousands of years. Beringia, with its permafrost soils and frozen sediments, has thus become one of the richest archives of ancient DNA on Earth. What melts from the ice or emerges from eroding riverbanks often carries molecular secrets that expand our understanding of human history. In this sense, climate both constrained human movement and preserved the evidence of that movement, shaping knowledge as much as experience. The scale of genetic time is immense. Mutations accumulate slowly, providing clocks that measure divergence over tens of thousands of years. To trace the ancestry of the first Americans through DNA is to work with spans of time that dwarf recorded history. Yet within these immense scales, the lives of individuals remain visible: an infant buried by the Tanana River, a hunter leaving traces of blood on a stone tool, a family shedding DNA into the soil of a cave. Each contributes a fragment to the genetic archive, together illuminating the journey across Beringia. Ancient DNA has not replaced archaeology or climatology, but it has become an essential partner. Together, these fields confirm that people lived in Beringia for thousands of years, isolated yet persistent before spreading swiftly across the Americas. The genetic evidence underscores the resilience of small populations to endure glacial confinement and then flourish once pathways opened. It also reminds us that humanity's story is not a straight line, but a web with branches of ancestry weaving together across continents and millennia. The clues preserved in ancient DNA ensure that even when landscapes vanish beneath seas and artifacts erode, the record of human presence endures at the molecular level. In the double helix of ancient genomes lies the memory of migration, isolation, and dispersal, a memory written in every cell of those who came after. The world of Beringia was shaped by forces that sculpted not only the terrain, but also the experience of life for those who lived there. It was a land of wind-swept plains, frozen rivers, and soil locked in permafrost, a place where each step was influenced by climate and geology as much as by human choice. To imagine this landscape is to picture an environment both forbidding and sustaining its extremes, demanding adaptation, yet offering the resources needed to endure. The physical world of Beringia left its imprint on every aspect of human existence, from the placement of camps to the tools that people carried. A fundamental fact of this environment is the presence of permafrost soil that remains frozen for years, decades, or millennia at a time. In Beringia, permafrost lay beneath much of the ground, freezing water in place and preventing deep root growth. This created a surface where only grasses, mosses, lichens, and dwarf shrubs could thrive, supporting the herds of herbivores that grazed across the plains. For humans, permafrost meant challenges in digging storage pits, securing shelters, and finding plant food, but it also preserved remains in remarkable condition. Many of the bones of mammoths, bison, and horses unearthed by archaeologists today are intact because permafrost protected them for tens of thousands of years. This frozen archive offers glimpses into the ecology that humans once depended upon. A lesser-known detail comes from the study of ancient wind-blown dust known as loess, which blanketed parts of Beringia. Layers of loess accumulated over thousands of years, carried by strong Ice Age winds sweeping across exposed shelves and plains. This dust altered the fertility of soils, influencing where plants could grow more thickly and where herds would graze. For humans, the patterns of vegetation shaped the routes of migration and the locations of camps. Loess deposits also created bluffs and terraces along rivers, some of which later became prime sites for archaeological preservation. In this way, even the dust of Beringia had lasting effects on human survival and on what evidence of that survival remains today. The unresolved mystery of these landscapes lies in how humans navigated them seasonally. Did they remain in certain valleys year-round, enduring the brutal winters in permanent camps? Or did they move with the seasons, following rivers to the coast in summer and retreating inland in winter? Archaeological traces provide hints, but no definitive answers. Some sites suggest repeated seasonal use with evidence of hearths and tool-making layered over centuries. Others hint at more temporary encampments abandoned as herds shifted. The rhythm of movement across this frozen landscape is still debated, and with much of Beringia submerged or eroded, the full picture may never be known. On the planetary scale, the landscapes of wind and permafrost illustrate the deep connections between climate, land, and life. Glacial cycles lowered sea levels and created permafrost zones across the north, reshaping habitats over thousands of kilometers. Winds carried dust that fertilized oceans, as well as land-altering global carbon cycles and influencing climate feedbacks. The frozen ground reflected sunlight back into space, amplifying cold conditions. Humans lived within this planetary system, their survival tied to processes occurring on scales far beyond their awareness. The story of Beringia is therefore part of Earth's broader climatic story, one in which ice, wind, and soil together determined the limits of life. The scale of the Beringian landscape was vast, stretching from the Kolyma River in Siberia across the exposed shelf to Alaska. At its broadest, the land bridge spanned more than 1,000 kilometers north to south and thousands east to west. For the people who lived there, horizons were wide and seemingly endless, with few landmarks other than rivers, low hills, and the silhouettes of animals moving across the plains. Travel across such distances was not undertaken in haste, but over generations, with families shifting ranges gradually. The immensity of the land meant that Beringia was not a narrow passage, but a full region of habitation, a subcontinent in its own right. Daily life in these landscapes was shaped by wind. Strong currents swept across the plains, carrying dust in winter and chilling the air even further. Shelters had to be built with care, often sunk slightly into the ground, or reinforced with mammoth bones and hides to resist the gusts. Fire was essential, yet wood was scarce. Driftwood carried by rivers and the remains of shrubs gathered from the tundra became precious fuel. In some cases, fat from hunted animals served as a substitute, burned in stone or bone lamps to provide light and heat. These adaptations show how every element of survival was influenced by the basic conditions of soil and wind. Archaeological discoveries give texture to this world. At Yana, RHS in Siberia, artifacts include finely worked tools of ivory and stone beads, carved with precision and traces of pigment use. Such finds reveal that even in the coldest environments, people maintain traditions of craft and symbolic behavior. At Bluefish Caves in Yukon, marks on animal bones suggest human activity more than 20,000 years ago, hinting at an even earlier presence in these frozen landscapes. These scattered sites together build the picture of humans inhabiting Beringia not as temporary visitors, but as long-term residents, accustomed to the cycles of wind, ice, and permafrost. For subsistence, the landscape offered both hardship and abundance. Herds of grazing animals provided primary food sources, yet winters were long and harsh. Storage pits lined with stone may have been used to preserve meat, though digging into frozen ground was difficult. Fishing in rivers and lakes during the brief summers added variety, while birds migrating north each spring brought seasonal abundance. Small plants, roots, and berries were gathered when available, though these never formed the bulk of the diet. Life was therefore a careful balance of hunting, storing, and moving, tuned to the cycles of an unforgiving but not barren land. Mystery also lingers around the use of the coastlines during this time. While much of the exposed Beringian shelf is now underwater, reconstructions suggest that wetlands and estuaries along the ancient coasts could have been important sources of fish and waterfowl. Did humans concentrate along these areas, or did they favor inland plains where herds were more numerous? With most of the evidence drowned, researchers must rely on models and scattered finds. The answer to this question influences not only our understanding of Beringian life, but also theories about how the first Americans dispersed southward. In planetary perspective, permafrost landscapes continue to shape human history even today. As global temperatures rise, thawing permafrost releases carbon and methane, influencing climate change. In the Ice Age, however, permafrost helped lock carbon away, contributing to the stability of cold conditions. The people of Beringia lived within this balance, unaware that their survival depended on frozen ground and wind-blown dust, as much as on fire and tools. Their adaptation illustrates the deep entanglement of human life with Earth's climate systems. For the people who called this land home, the landscapes of wind and permafrost were not an abstraction but a lived reality. They built shelters against the gusts, lit lamps with animal fat, tracked herds across plains, and endured winters of darkness and cold. Each generation carried knowledge of where rivers froze last, where driftwood could be found, and where animals gathered in spring. Their lives unfolded in rhythms set by the frozen earth, an existence fragile yet resilient, sustained in one of the harshest environments of the Ice Age world. The question of how the first humans entered the Americas remains one of the most enduring mysteries in prehistory. The land bridge of Beringia connected Asia and North America, but beyond it lay barriers of ice and sea. For decades, archaeologists believed that humans only moved southward after the retreat of the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets through an inland corridor that opened around 13,000 years ago. This model, long called the Clovis First hypothesis, held that people crossed Beringia, waited at the margins, and then moved south when the ice cleared. Yet, discoveries of earlier archaeological sites and new genetic and paleo-environmental evidence have complicated this picture, raising questions about whether the first crossing into the Americas was made inland along the Pacific coast or by a combination of both. The fact that grounds this debate is clear. The interior ice-free corridor, once thought to be the sole pathway, was not fully open until after about 13,000 years ago. By that time, archaeological sites such as Monte Verde in Chile were already occupied with dates reaching at least 14,500 years ago. This means that people must have reached South America before the corridor was accessible. The conclusion is unavoidable. An earlier route, likely along the Pacific coast, must have carried people south before the inland passage existed. The Clovis First model no longer holds as a universal explanation. A lesser-known detail comes from geological reconstructions of the coastal landscape. During the last glacial maximum, sea levels were far lower, exposing a broad coastal plain now submerged beneath the Pacific. Along this plain, kelp forests flourished in the cold, nutrient-rich waters, creating what some researchers call the kelp highway. Such ecosystems would have provided abundant resources, fish, shellfish, sea mammals, and seaweeds that could sustain migrating groups. Archaeological evidence from later coastal peoples shows the effectiveness of marine subsistence, suggesting that early migrants may have used similar strategies. While the direct evidence from the earliest period lies underwater and largely inaccessible, the ecological plausibility of a coastal migration is strong. The unresolved mystery is the exact timing and route of the first crossing. Did people hug the Pacific shoreline, traveling by foot and perhaps by simple watercraft, exploiting shellfish and fish along the way? Or did some groups enter earlier through seasonal windows in the ice sheets, using interior valleys before glaciers fully closed them? The archaeological record offers hints but no definitive answers. Sites like Bluefish Caves in Yukon and potentially older finds in the Americas suggest earlier presence, but their interpretation remains debated. The story of the first crossing is thus marked by uncertainty, with multiple possibilities still under consideration. On a planetary scale, the significance of this debate is profound. The opening and closing of routes into the Americas depended on the advance and retreat of ice sheets, kilometers thick, driven by shifts in Earth's orbit and climate. Human movement across continents was dictated by cycles beyond human control, by planetary forces shaping coastlines and mountains. The timing of when paths opened was tied directly to global climate, emphasizing once again that human migration is inseparable from the larger rhythms of Earth. The first crossing was not simply a decision by small groups of people, but the result of opportunities created by planetary processes. The scale of the migration underscores the challenge. From the Bering Strait region to the southern tip of South America is more than 15,000 kilometers, nearly a third of the Earth's circumference. Yet within a few thousand years of the first entry, humans had reached every major region of the continent. This astonishing speed suggests that once barriers were removed, dispersal was rapid and adaptive. Small groups moving generation by generation could cover such distances through gradual expansion. Camps established along rivers and coasts served as stepping stones, each one extending the frontier farther. In this sense, the mystery of the first crossing is not only about entry, but also about the remarkable swiftness with which the Americas were populated once entry occurred. Archaeological discoveries continue to shift the timeline. Sites such as Paisley Caves in Oregon with coprolites dated to more than 14,000 years ago, and Page Ladson in Florida with evidence of human activity around the same time push back the chronology of human presence in North America. Even more controversial are claims of sites with earlier dates, such as possible tool marks on mastodon bones in California, though these remain disputed. Each discovery reopens the question of how early the first crossing occurred and whether multiple waves of migration may have taken place. The lack of consensus highlights the fragmentary nature of evidence from such deep time. Genetics adds another layer of complexity. Ancient DNA indicates that the ancestors of Native Americans diverged from East Asian populations around 23,000 years ago, consistent with a period of isolation in Beringia. By about 15 to 16,000 years ago, genetic lineages are already established across the Americas, suggesting dispersal was well underway. This genetic timeline aligns with a coastal migration route, as inland passage was blocked until later. Yet some genetic signals hint at more complexity, including possible later admixture events. Whether these represent separate migrations or movements within the Americas remains debated. The genetic record supports early entry, but leaves open details of how many crossings occurred. The environment of the first crossing would have been demanding. The coastal route, while rich in resources, also presented hazards. Glaciers carving into the ocean, storms sweeping along exposed shores, and narrow strips of habitable land between ice and sea. Inland routes, when briefly open, would have required passage through valleys bordered by walls of ice. Both pathways demanded resilience and flexibility, as well as technologies suited to each challenge. Lightweight shelters, water-resistant clothing, and perhaps watercraft would have been essential. Archaeological evidence for boats does not survive from this period, but later coastal peoples demonstrate long traditions of seafaring, making it plausible that such skills existed earlier. The first crossing also raises questions about perception. For those living in Beringia, the movement southward may not have been conceived as a great migration, but as a series of seasonal journeys following game or searching for new fishing grounds. Only in retrospect does the path appear as a continent-spanning dispersal. To those who took the steps, it may have been simply the continuation of a way of life, moving along rivers, coasts, and valleys in search of sustenance. This perspective reminds us that the mystery is shaped by modern categories. For the people themselves, the movement was part of daily survival rather than an intentional crossing of boundaries. In the end, the first crossing remains unresolved, its details submerged beneath seas or buried beneath millennia of sediment. The evidence that does survive suggests a story both simple and complex. Simple in that humans, adaptable and resourceful, found a way through when opportunities appeared. Complex in that the exact routes, timing and strategies remain uncertain. The mystery itself reflects the fragility of the archaeological record and the vastness of time involved. What can be said with confidence is that by the time ice sheets retreated and corridors opened, people were already present deep within the Americas. Whether by coasts or valleys, they had crossed, carrying with them the knowledge, traditions, and resilience forged in Beringia. The details may elude us, but the crossing itself stands as one of humanity's most remarkable achievements, a movement into a hemisphere untouched by humans, guided not by maps or intentions, but by the interplay of climate, landscape, and persistence. Much of what is known about the earliest people of Beringia and the Americas comes not from monumental structures or clear settlements, but from faint traces left behind in the soil. Unlike later agricultural societies, these Ice Age groups did not build permanent villages of stone or wood. Their lives were mobile, following herds and seasons, and the camps they made were temporary. Yet, within these impermanent places, fragments of existence remain: stone flakes from tool-making ash, from hearths, bones with cut marks, and beads carved from ivory. Scattered and subtle, these traces form the foundation for reconstructing one of the most significant human migrations in history. A key fact is that sites across Alaska, Yukon, and Siberia show repeated human presence during the late Pleistocene, though often only in small quantities of artifacts. The Bluefish Caves in Yukon preserve animal bones with marks consistent with butchery, suggesting people lived in the region more than 20,000 years ago. In Siberia, campsites such as Yana RHS reveal dense accumulations of tools and ornaments dating to over 30,000 years ago, indicating long-term adaptation to Arctic life. These finds, though separated by thousands of kilometers, demonstrate that humans not only reached the far north, but also endured there, leaving behind modest yet enduring signs of their existence. A lesser-known detail of these hidden camps lies in the evidence of craft and ornamentation. At Yana, ivory beads and pendants have been discovered, carefully shaped and polished. In other Beringian sites, fragments of ochre appear, hinting at the use of pigments for decoration or symbolic purposes. Such artifacts reveal that even in harsh environments, people carried traditions of artistry and symbolism. The presence of beads in temporary camps suggests that cultural expression was integrated into daily life, not confined to special occasions. These details remind us that human presence was not only about subsistence, but also about identity and meaning, carried even into the coldest landscapes. Mystery surrounds many of these traces, particularly in distinguishing human activity from natural processes. Bones can be broken by freezing and thawing as well as by stone tools. Marks that resemble cuts may also come from carnivore teeth. Distinguishing genuine evidence of human butchery requires careful microscopic analysis. At Bluefish Caves, for example, the debate continues about whether all marks on bones truly reflect human activity or if some result from natural forces. This ambiguity highlights the fragility of the evidence and the challenge of reconstructing behavior from fragmentary remains. The mystery persists: how far back does human occupation in the Americas really go, and how many traces are simply invisible or misinterpreted? On the planetary scale, the preservation of these traces depends on geological and climatic conditions. Permafrost can lock artifacts and bones in place for tens of thousands of years, while erosion can erase them in a single season. Rivers meandering across plains can both expose and destroy ancient camps. The rising of seas after the Ice Age submerged entire landscapes, hiding untold numbers of sites beneath the ocean floor. The distribution of what survives is therefore uneven, shaped by forces beyond human control. The story reconstructed from hidden camps is not the whole story, but a fragment shaped by preservation and loss across the planet. The scale of invisibility is immense. Archaeologists estimate that only a small fraction of all ancient camps have been discovered, and an even smaller fraction preserved in ways that allow detailed study. For every hearth ringed with stone that survives, hundreds may have vanished without a trace. The great majority of human life in Beringia and early America is therefore absent from the record, a reminder of the limits of knowledge when dealing with deep time. What is preserved, however, is enough to confirm presence and suggest patterns, even if details remain elusive. Archaeological sites in Alaska provide vivid examples of these traces. At Swan Point, remains of microblades and animal bones suggest repeated occupation around 14,000 years ago. At Broken Mammoth, evidence of tool-making and hearths shows how groups used river terraces as seasonal camps. These sites were not permanent villages, but places where people paused, hunted, cooked and crafted. Over centuries, repeated use left behind layers of ash stone, flakes and bones, building a record of continuity. Such camps reveal mobility combined with familiarity. People return to the same favorable places year after year, weaving a pattern of movement across the land. Genetic and isotopic studies add further detail to the story of these camps. DNA recovered from sediments at sites in Siberia confirms the presence of humans even when bones are absent, while isotopic analysis of animal remains reveals what resources were hunted most intensively. Together, these methods expand the scope of evidence, allowing archaeologists to see traces invisible to the naked eye. They confirm that hidden camps were not isolated anomalies but part of a broader pattern of life across Beringia. Mystery also surrounds the use of fire in these temporary camps. Hearths are common, but the scarcity of wood raises questions about what fuel was used. Driftwood carried from distant forests may have been vital along rivers and coasts, while animal fat may have served as fuel inland. Burned bone fragments in many sites suggest that bones themselves were used as firewood, cracked open for marrow and then burned for heat. The practical ingenuity of these strategies reveals adaptation to scarcity, but the specifics remain unclear. Did families plan carefully for fuel supplies, or did they improvise with what each landscape offered? The answers remain uncertain, glimpsed only in scattered layers of ash. On a global scale, these camps are part of the broader story of how humans adapted to temporary habitation during the Ice Age. From Europe to Africa to Australia, groups moved seasonally, building ephemeral shelters and leaving faint traces behind. The Beringian camps fit into this global pattern, yet they carry particular significance as the staging grounds for entry into the Americas. Each campfire, each flake of stone marks a step in a journey that would ultimately span 2 continents. The universality of hidden traces emphasizes both the fragility and resilience of human life across the planet. The scale of migration measured through these camps underscores the vastness of human movement. Each site represents not a permanent settlement but a waypoint, a pause in a long chain of journeys. Over thousands of years, such waypoints accumulated into a transcontinental dispersal. The presence of a hearth in Alaska or a butchered bone in Yukon signals not only survival in that moment, but also the continuity of a migration stretching from Eurasia into new worlds. In this sense, hidden camps are markers of transition, small fragments of a much larger trajectory. Ultimately, the hidden camps and traces of early humans reveal both the power and limits of archaeology. They provide confirmation that people lived, hunted and crafted in Beringia and the Americas long before written history. They also remind us how much has been lost, erased by erosion, submerged by seas, or never preserved in the first place. The faintness of the record does not diminish its importance. Rather, it emphasizes the resilience of human life in leaving even the smallest of marks across time. These traces, modest yet enduring, connect the lives of prehistoric families to the vast narrative of human migration. During the height of the Ice Age, the Northern Hemisphere was divided by colossal ice sheets that shaped not only landscapes, but also the destinies of people. In North America, the Laurentide ice sheet spread from the Atlantic coast across much of present-day Canada, while the Cordilleran ice sheet cloaked the western mountains. Between them, Glaciers converged in a wall of ice that rose like a continent unto itself, kilometers thick and stretching for thousands of kilometers from east to west. These frozen barriers divided world's Beringia to the north and west, rich in steppe tundra and herds, and the unpeopled Americas to the south. The ice did not simply block passage, it defined entire chapters of human migration.